Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming for part 3 of our wonderful series on Sephardic Jews and race in the United States, exploring systemic racism in Sephardic Jewry with Dr. Devin Naar, the Isaac Alhadeff Professor of Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington. Just a quick note, we want to first say thank you so much to the generous support of the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for making this talk possible, as well as our partners at Congregation Or for Shalom and the Seattle Sephardic Network for their continuous partnership and continuous support through all these amazing new initiatives. This is a part of our brand new Sephardic Digital Academy, a national online learning platform we started through the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, La Hermandad Sefaradit de America, in the Sephardic Ladino language, de los Muertos, our own, with all other amazing courses as well. This is not just one of many, many courses, including on Sephardic Torah, Sephardic Halakha, Sephardic culture, Ladino language classes, Ladino introductory courses, Sephardic cooking classes, Sephardic history, Greek Jewish history, Turkish Jewish history, and so much more. I encourage you all to please explore all the amazing offers we have through educators around the country and around the world at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Now, it's my dear pleasure and honor to introduce a man who in our De los Muertos community needs no introduction, Dr. Devin Naar. Professor Naar, please, whenever you are ready.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. Thank you, Ethan, for again organizing this series and all of the other activities related to the Sephardic Digital Academy of the Brotherhood. It's been really a very meaningful experience for me to share some of my research and perspectives with all of you over the last couple of lectures, and looking forward to our final one in this series. Before moving forward, I would also like to echo Ethan in extending my appreciation to the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation, as well as to Congregation Or Shalom for their support in making this program possible. As I've done in some of the other sessions, in this one too, I'd like to begin with a kind of a family anecdote. And it actually begins with this document here. And this is a copy of a wedding invitation in English and in Ladino for my great aunt and my great uncle. My great aunt Miriam, Mary, as she was known, married a gentleman by the name of Shlomo Ayush. What I find fascinating about this document, you know, I've seen this document many times, but finally I really looked at it, and I was really intrigued to discover where they got married. So you can see here it's in English and it's Ladino. You can see some of the elements that really shows that they're part of the American culture here, that my great-grandfather Hacham or Rabbi Benjamin Naar is listed here as Reverend. That was sort of the title for clergy. But what was really fascinating here is that where did their wedding take place? In New Brunswick, New Jersey. That's where I was born, where my father was born. But it takes place, this Sephardic couple, both of whom were born in Salonika, both of whom were born in the Ottoman Empire, while Salonika was still part of the Ottoman Empire. They got married, they got married at the Workmen Circle Institute in New Brunswick. And this really struck me as fascinating. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Workmen's Circle is still in existence today. It was founded in 1892 as essentially a Yiddish socialist mutual aid society that had the twin aims of supporting members with medical and death benefits, as well as supporting essentially labor and socialist movements, as well as getting involved in arts and culture and theater to promote both of those kinds of goals. What are we supposed to take away from this? Was this just a nice kind of like a social hall in the neighborhood that they were able to rent out? Or is there something more going on here? What was the relationship between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim? And was there some kind of socialist connection here? Now, I thought that was maybe a little bit far-fetched, to be honest, but then you start thinking a little bit more and maybe some pieces come together. The next, and here's a photograph of my great aunt and my great uncle. I did not know them, but I knew and know their children. Their son, Maurice, Moshe, he went into business with my grandfather and another one of my great uncles in the Narbest Food Company. And you could see here that the food business was very important for the family. And I discussed this a little bit more last time. But I was kind of struck by the name of the grocery store, the People's Grocery Store. Now, maybe I'm reading into this a little bit too much, but okay, the People's Grocery could have a kind of a political connotation, or it could just mean that it was, open to the people. It is interesting to observe that their grocery store was in some ways protected during the race uprising in New Brunswick in the 60s. It was not a major one like happened in other parts of the countries, but the story goes that my great uncle Solomon Ayash had good relations with his customers, including his black customers, loaned them money, and his store was protected. Now, does that have anything to do with political affiliation, or he was just a good guy? It could be either one. It's also important to recognize that he did go out of his way to stock foods that that catered to his clientele, including his black clientele, so like collard greens, as well as other foods that were shared between blacks and Sephardic Jews, like okra. This is a very important connection, the food here, but southern cooking, black cooking, okra, and also Sephardic cooking, okra bamyas. Bamya is very, very important part of that cuisine. So it might be a stretch, but on the other hand, regardless of whether my great aunt and my great uncle, what their political orientation was, it is definitely true that one of their cousins, Ayash cousins, was deeply involved in the socialist movement and more. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later. More than that, for Salonican and other Levantine Sephardic Jews in the early 20th century, socialism was in fact part and parcel of their world. And as Lou Menashe, who is a member of this organization, the Sephardic Brotherhood, and an important scholar of Soviet film, he recalls growing up in his family, which they were not socialists, but he remembers that members of the family knew socialist songs. So it was part of kind of the ether, part of the broader culture. And in fact, what I'm going to try to show you is that the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, the organization that is sponsoring these events, has a very strong socialist orientation at its roots and at its foundation. But that's a long lost history. Probably the leadership of the organization, the members of the Brotherhood today do not think of their organization and its socialist roots. It probably doesn't fit our narrative of how we'd like to see ourselves as respectable middle-class white people. It probably doesn't fit our expectations about Sephardic Jews. We're sort of told in the way that Sephardic culture and identity can enter Jewish conversations and American conversations that we don't have politics, or at least we don't have politics due to our Sephardic identity. Sephardic food is good. Sephardic songs and canticas, that's good. Liturgy and customs, that is good. But politics, and certainly progressive or even radical politics, that's not us. We get the story that's told, our families came from the old country and they were not really well educated and they were not political, they were not politicized, they were not really interested. And we can even hear this narrative coming from prominent people within our community who have said and written about this. And I consider this a really dramatic kind of whitewash of our history. And from another perspective, you may have heard, as I have heard many, many times, something to the effect of, well, the Sephardic and the Mizrahi Jews, they are traditional and they are conservative and they are right wing. And you'll say, look at Israel. And those claims, I hear them from friends, I hear them from colleagues in the field of Jewish studies. They are replications and internalizations of the same kinds of racist and Oriental tropes that we've been discussing in these talks. So I'd like to disabuse ourselves of that mythology, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Sephardic politics. It is part of what I see of a process of presenting, engaging with, and thinking about all aspects of Sephardic life, identity, and experience. This talk comes as the third in the series of 3 talks. The first talk was titled Confrontation. And here we looked at the ways in which the immigration and naturalization systems were set up in this country. Essentially, especially with regard to naturalization, we looked at the ways in which, in order to become an American citizen in the United States from 1790 until the middle of the 20th century, essentially there was only one criterion: to be a free white person. Okay? So what we see is that when Levantine Sephardic Jews enter the United States or try to enter the United States, they are going to encounter both immigration and naturalization systems that are set up not to welcome them, to exclude them, or to minimize them, or to make them pay a very great cost to enter into this country and enter into American society and claim the mantle of an American. What's key here is that the US government even set up a very specific racial hierarchy. And you can see this in the chart. I've shown it in the other talks as well. And that demonstrate who counts as Caucasian, as white, and who does not, according to the thinking of race science and eugenics that was very popular and widespread all throughout every domain of American policymaking and politics in the early 20th century. And that leads us essentially to how Sephardic Jews tried to navigate this system. And that's what we talked about in the second session. You know, I referred to W.E.B. Du Bois, the very famous Black American thinker, who identified that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And what we looked at here was the way in which Levantine Jews, who were sort of at the border of white and not white, sought to traverse that divide and get on the white side of things. The white side of things that would provide Levantine Jews with the rights and protections and privileges that would come with whiteness, that would come with citizenship, and that would come with Americanness, understanding those as essentially identical aspects of identity. We looked at how race is not only about color, it's an ideological, cultural, political, and legal concept that's regularly reconstructed based on context and contingency. It's not neutral. It's not a biologically determined element of nature, although it draws on corporeal elements, on physical elements. But the meanings that are given to those elements are completely fabricated. We also looked at how whiteness becomes a vortex in the United States, because the only way to gain the protections and privileges of citizenship are contingent upon demonstrating your whiteness in this country until racial prerequisites for citizenship were abolished in 1952. So everybody who was sort of eligible to possibly become white, which was essentially by demonstrating that you are not Black, could get sucked into this vortex, or willingly or strategically tried to enter. And that's what we looked at in this navigation talk. We looked at the ways in which mutual aid organizations and the Ladino newspapers, mutual aid organizations like the Sephardic Brotherhood, contributed to help Sephardic Jews navigate this system, to try to get them in on the white side of the line, and furthermore, to help them move up the hierarchy. Not to say, you know, this racial hierarchy that has the American Indian at the bottom, and part of my language is the Negro at the bottom, and then moves up, up, up till we get to the Middle East, and then we get to Eastern Europe, and then we get to Southern Europe, then we get to Eastern Europe, then we get to Western Europe. I mean, these hierarchies are still with us, right, when we talk about immigration. What Sephardic Jews tried to do as a largely disempowered, newly arriving group was to try to position themselves to best raise themselves up in this hierarchy, not to overturn it. And almost nobody tried to overturn it. People who were on the border between white and not white, Syrians and Armenians, and even Asian immigrants, Chinese and Japanese, they all tried to demonstrate that they were white and thus eligible for citizenship. One of the strategies that Levantine Sephardic Jews try to undertake that I described to move up this hierarchy was to demonstrate, no, they are not Turks. They're not way down here at the hierarchy. No, they're not Hebrews either. That's not how they should necessarily be seen. No, no, we can move up. Let's call ourselves Spanish. Let's invoke our Spanish origins and claim descent from Spain. And let's call ourselves not Oriental Jews, not Turkish, not Ottoman, not Levantine, but Sephardim, Sephardic Jews who have a very famous history, legacy, and mythology in the broader Jewish imagination. By demonstrating that they were Spanish, they could enter into Europeanness and whiteness and prove themselves to the American white public. And by claiming the mantle of Sephardic Judaism, they could gain legitimacy in the eyes of the Ashkenazi Jewish populations that constituted really the bulk of American Jewry at this time. They saw themselves as the Jews par excellence in America, and Yiddish identity and culture was essentially, and as it still is to a large degree, synonymous with Jewishness in America. Okay? Now, in some ways, the same kinds of antagonisms that impacted previous ways of migration are replicated here. You know, so Irish, who were the brunt of discrimination on the part of the British, would in turn become some of the chief proponents of anti-Asian sentiment. Okay, you have also Cubans who came before Castro, looking down and despising those who came after Castro. And you have many other examples like this. In the Jewish experience, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews associated with like Congregation Shereth Israel in uptown in New York, they looked down at the German Jews who came in the 19th century. Together, they looked down upon the masses of the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews who came to the country at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. And together, all of those groups looked down on the Levantine Jews, who they saw as outside of the European standards of civilization and maybe part of what they would like to call white society. But they were also very anxious about how associations with these newcomers from the Muslim world would reflect on them. The one distinction, and this is very important to make here, that separates the attitudes between these other earlier Jewish waves of migration and this new one is that in the case of the Levantine Jews, the earlier established Jewish communities, especially Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews, sometimes did not even acknowledge the Levantine Ottoman Jews as Jewish in the first place. And this is really I think, a symptom of the internalization of these racial hierarchies that were literally codified by American laws and practices, as you can see in this document. What I'd like to do today is I would like to demonstrate the way in which Sephardic Jews not only confronted the unjust systems that have shaped American society, sought to navigate and move up in that unjust system, but also attempted in some ways, largely invisible to us today, sought to transform our society through participation in political and social movements that in some instances created ties and bonds across racial and ethnic divides. And in order to understand the political movements that Sephardic Jews in the United States participated in, we have to move back for a moment to the old country. We have to go back to the Ottoman Empire. We have to go back to the city of Salonika, which was one of the largest and most important homes of Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews in the history of the world, and also the city from which all of the founders of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America first came. What's fascinating, and I wrote a whole book about the Jews of Salonika, and I'm going to give you just a couple of little pieces that I think are relevant for our story today. Salonika was a cultural capital, it was a rabbinical capital, it was a publishing capital, but it was also a labor and industrial capital in the Ottoman Empire, in which Jews played a disproportionately large role. Over half the population of the city of Salonika were Jews at the turn of the 20th century. The Jewish imprint was so pronounced that even the port closed on Shabbat every week in recognition of the predominance and prosperity of the city's Jews. You may have heard that, but what you might not know is how Salonican industrial productivity became so pronounced by the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century, and how Salonika took on the mantle of such a major Jewish cultural and industrial center in the 20th century. This has actually to do with what was going on in the United States. Yes. And it has to do with the Civil War. The Civil War, as we know, among the many things that happened, including the emancipation of the slaves and then the outward migration of free blacks from the South, is kind of like a general strike, as W.B. Du Bois referred to it, leaving the sharecropping spaces that were made available to them in the South. Many went north, and there was the industrial productivity in the South was incredibly diminished in terms of cash crops like cotton and tobacco. And it just turns out that in this part of the Eastern Mediterranean, these same crops were also being produced. And with the introduction of new technologies, industrial technologies, factories for the production of cotton and tobacco, as well as new technologies that connected this city to the broader world with the introduction of the steamship in the beginning of the 19th century, with the creation of a modern port at the city of Salonika, and with a very extensive railroad system that linked Salonika to the capitals of the center of Europe, from Vienna to Paris and beyond. By the end of the 19th century, Salonika was a major industrial producer and exporter, especially of crops like tobacco. There were many factories that were established in Salonika and the areas nearby, not only for tobacco, but also for bricks, flour, cotton, as I mentioned, wool, beer, raki, like ouzo, raka, tile, carpet, shoes, soap, nails, chairs. There was even a macaroni factory. And what's unusual about the industrial production of Salonika at this time was that most of the owners of the factories and the plurality, if not the absolute majority of the workers, were also Jewish. And this is what separated Salonika from many of the other very important Mediterranean Jewish communities at the time, in which Jews played important roles, but didn't have such a predominant role in the industrial and labor sector. Not in Istanbul, not in Izmir, not in Rhodes. Just to give you some figures, there were 70,000 to 80,000 Jews living in Salonika. There were 5,000 Jews in Rhodes. Okay, and then Istanbul and Izmir were somewhere in between. And what we see also in Salonika is that Jews were involved in every aspect of the economy. And you will see by the turn of the 20th century, the largest proportion of those laborers were working in the factories. 8,000 factory workers in all those factories. These are all Jews. Porters working at the port, importing, exporting. Okay? If you think about it like this, okay? About 6% of the Ottoman Empire's population lived in Salonika, but about a quarter of the empire's Jews lived there. So there's a very disproportionate representation of Jews. And about 15% of all of the empire's exports passed through the port of Salonika. So it was disproportionately major industrial creator and exporter, which brought many people to the city and provided job opportunities. But many of those opportunities, as we will see, were not of very high quality. The port workers, and I'm going to give you just this example here. They were organized as taifes, which are kind of like guilds or brotherhoods. This was even before the industrialization era began. And we have already here the kernel of mutual aid societies. So some of the elements that an organization like the Sephardic Brotherhood will be built on in the United States were already operative in the old world. So like mutual aid draws not only on American ideas, but is rooted in some more traditional Ottoman Jewish and Jewish practices more generally. So what were these taifas like, these kinds of brotherhoods for workers? They were often extended family units. They didn't really have a hierarchical structure. They came together for prayers, especially mincha, the afternoon prayer service. They gathered after work to drink raki at the me'anat, the taverns, where they would speak about work and perhaps discuss politics. They shared their income equally, and they kept their books together. And they would put aside a portion in their communal chest to pay for charitable purposes, to cover sick benefits, medical expenses, and burial costs. And they would also provide payouts in the case of death. Those payouts would go to the widows, and those widows could decide whether to give those positions in the taifa to their sons. It could be transmitted according from generation to generation, or they could sell it to a new member. And importantly, each member of the taifa also got a bottle of raki for their private consumption during the week. This is an element of mutual aid here. But this kind of process of mutual aid will get politicized very deeply in the 20th century in the context of the rise of mass politics and constitutional government in the Ottoman Empire. And we can see that really emerging in the wake of the famous Young Turk Revolution, which was proclaimed from the streets of Salonika itself in 1908, which resulted in the reinstitution of an Ottoman constitution, as well as the overthrow and exiling of the Sultan, the introduction of an Ottoman parliament, and essentially what we might call modern parliamentarian government, including voting and suffrage. And here you can see the image on the right of a gentleman wearing the modern Ottoman garb of the fez. He's got the mustache and a sword. And you can see there the crowds gathered with all the languages of the empire. We have Ottoman Turkish and Arabic. We have French. We have Bulgarian. We have Ladino. Viva la libertad, it says here. And there were celebrations throughout Salonika and throughout the Ottoman Empire in all the major cities. Here it says in Ottoman Turkish, Yaşasın millet, long live the nation, the Ottoman nation, of which all the different nationalities, all the different religious groups, all the different ethnic groups of the empire would come together, bonded in their difference, acknowledging their cultural and ethnic differences, but coming together in their shared political dedication to the Ottoman state and to the experiment with parliamentary politics. Okay? And we can get a sense of that in a song that I'd like to play for you that gives you a sense of sort of this idea of brotherhood that was a momentary, a fleeting, but very, very important chapter in late Ottoman history before a series of wars would destroy this concept of brotherhood, result in mass carnage, including the Armenian genocide. But I want to focus for a moment on this principle of brotherhood that would be articulated in the moment of the Young Turk Revolution. Oop, how do I play this?
Mancebos de los casales y muchos de Salonic, mos hicimos voluntarios, mos fuimos a las Kierlik, y a la libertad se va a hacer, y a nuestra sangre se va a verter por amor de la Turquía. Turcos, judíos y cristianos, todos otomanos, nos tomimos de las manos, jurimos de ser hermanos.
Okay. As you can see in this song, this idea, Turks, Jews, and Christians, by which they mean Muslims, Jews, and Christians, they're all Ottomans. They have this shared kind of political identity, despite or even because of their cultural, religious, linguistic, and ethnic differences. This idea, we will be brothers. We will be brothers. And in the wake of the Young Turk Revolution, which opened up new liberties along the lines of the European revolutions, freedom to assemble, freedom of press, and many other kinds of opportunities, party politics emerged in the Ottoman Empire for the first time, including in Salonika. And Salonika, it was maybe like politics on like a kind of almost a radical, in terms of a super kind of political dynamism emerged in Salonika, including among the city's Jews. And by the 1920s, there were no fewer than 10 specifically Jewish political parties of the entire spectrum, from socialists to liberals and assimilationists to diaspora nationalists to religious Zionists to secular Zionists. And even by the 30s, you would have a small group of Jewish fascists in Salonika, all of whom participated in the institution of the Jewish community, which was recognized by the Ottoman state, and for which there was even a miniature Jewish parliament in which you would elect members to represent your interests from those different parties to advocate for different positions within the Jewish community. So it's within this framework that we see the emergence of the Socialist Workers' Federation in Salonika, which would try to bring together not only the Jewish workers that we described before, who were, some of whom were languishing or suffering under very poor working conditions, including young men and especially young women working in these major factories that was bringing so much wealth and opportunity into the city of Salonika that was disproportionately enriching the bourgeois classes, the middle classes, and especially the wealthier industrial classes to the detriment of the working classes. And what's fascinating is the gentleman who created the Socialist Workers' Federation, which would be the largest workers' movement and the most dynamic and important socialist movement in the entire Middle East, in all of the Ottoman Empire, was established by a Jewish figure, Avram Ben Aroy, who was born in Bulgaria and came to Salonika in the wake of the Young Turk Revolution and eventually became one of the founders of the Communist Party of Greece during World War I. He was initially very drawn to the Ottomanist ideals that were embedded in the Young Turk Revolution, this idea that we can be all together in our differences. So this is not an assimilationist kind of model. It's like, in order to be one, we have to be the same. No, in order to be united, we can preserve our differences, and that is okay. It actually makes us richer. It enriches our identities, our culture, and our opportunities for collaboration and solidaridad, solidarity. So he writes in his memoirs, for example, the Ottoman nation is composed of numerous nationalities living on the same territory and having each a different language, culture, literature, customs, and characteristics. For ethnic and linguistic reasons, we have considered it desirable to form an organization to which all the nationalities might adhere without abandoning their own language and culture. Better still, every one of them will be able to develop independently its culture and its individuality while working for the same ideal, the socialist ideal. Now, of course, you probably think, oh, socialism, this is a very loaded term, and I understand that, and I want to just bring to your attention the way that when we're speaking about socialism in the beginning of the 20th century, what we are talking about, okay? I would just mention that among the organizers of the Socialist Federation, it initially published a newspaper in 4 languages, in Ladino, in Greek, in Bulgarian, and Turkish, to cater to all of his members. But the bulk of the membership wound up being Ladino-speaking Jews, and they published La Solidaridad Obradera. The Workers' Solidarity was their main magazine, newspaper, and it continued under the name Avanti, forward through the 1930s. The organizers among the Jewish workers included figures with names like Dasa, Hasson, Alavi, Aguel, Nehama, Arditi, Rekanati, Hazan, Menashe, Amarillo, Ben Rubi, Modiano, Amon, Yona. These are names that are familiar to the membership of the Sephardic Brotherhood, no doubt. So what does it mean to be socialist in this moment? And here is from a leaflet I'm going to quote from for you. I don't have the text here, but I'm going to quote from it for you. It's for a May 1st celebration, a May Day celebration, Workers' Day celebration. Number 1, 8-hour workday, not 10 to 12 hours, not 15-hour workday. Why is an 8-hour workday important? Because with an 8-hour workday, you get some free time to relax, time to educate themselves, time to spend with family. In short, and I quote, we would realize the principle of working to live and not living to work. The other main goal of socialism, as articulated by the Workers' Federation in Salonika at the time, was to claim our rights. The right to form organizations, the right to demonstrate, the right to assemble, the right to vote, the right to be voted for, the right to free speech, thought and writing, the freedom of press and conscience. In short, rights, equality, and broad freedoms for all. Those rights are needed, they argued, to arm ourselves in order to combat injustice and unmask hypocrisy, to demand protection for women and children, the old and the ill, the weak and the unemployed, and to promote the education of the masses. These arms will allow us to stop the insanity of war and exorbitant military expenditures. These same arms will serve us so that someday we can take public power into our own hands to realize our collective ambitions. In order to take these arms in hand, it is not enough simply to demand. We also need a social force that can hold people accountable. The force is collective action. The more organized we are, the better off we will be. Long live the workers' organization, their May Day petition concludes. Long live socialism. So that's what they mean when they are speaking about socialism at this time. Okay? And this demand for action was immediately realized in the case of Salonika. Over the course of 5 months after the formation of the Workers' Federation, there were 111 strikes organized in different labor industries across the empire, 31 of which were in Salonika. 6,000 people took to the streets to protest new government laws that were seeking to push down and put down the strikes that were brought to bear as a result of the initiative of the owners of these factories, who did not want to meet the demands for shorter work hours, for better conditions, for better pay. What made the Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonika distinct, I would suggest, was that it really was not assimilationist. It argued, as I already said, you can be Jewish, Ottoman, and a socialist, that these were corresponding and correlating identities. You didn't have to abandon one for the other. The other element that separated the Salonican socialist workers, and especially the position of the Jews, was the fact that, unlike in other parts of Eastern Europe, especially where Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews would also be drawn to socialism, in the case of Salonika, there was no major anti-Jewish violence that was prompting them to move in this direction. There are very few recorded outbursts of anti-Jewish violence in the history of the Ottoman Empire, and essentially none in Salonika until the 1930s, after it becomes part of Greece. So the Jewish workers in Salonika came at this organizing effort with a kind of confidence that we didn't really see in other kinds of communities. The other thing that was very important was that the socialist movement, under the direction of Ben Arroyo, decided that they were going to work within the Jewish community. They didn't say, screw the community, we're going to do this on our own. They said, no, we need to bring these same principles to bear inside of our community to improve our position and the position of our community as a whole. And we will do that in cooperation with other workers in other communities across the city. So socialism in Salonika was not atheistic. It was not radical in terms of its antagonism against religion. In fact, the offices of the Socialist Workers' Federation held Shabbat services. Okay. The other thing that's very important to notice about the Workers' Federation was that it was a major defender of the Ladino language. By the turn of the 20th century, Ladino was already under attack by the assimilationists or the Europeanizers who wanted Jews to speak a real language of civilization like French. It was under attack by those who wanted the Jews to assimilate into the culture of the local state environment and wanted them to learn Turkish or later Greek. And it was under assault by the burgeoning Zionist movement that would be created at the same exact moment in the wake of the Young Turk Revolution, that argued that Jews should be reviving the historic language of the Jewish people and preparing to return to the historic land of the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael. And in order to accomplish that, in order to participate in the Zionist movement, Sephardic Jews need to learn Hebrew. Well, the socialists were really among the only most fervent defenders of the Ladino language, because they saw it as the language of the people, the language of the worker. And not only that, but they use their newspaper as a way to renovar la lengua, to renew the language and to bring terms into the language that would make them able to speak about politics, speak about economics, speak about production, speak about power in their own language. And they brought terms, especially from French and Italian and even English. Grevistas became the word for strikers, from grève, from French. And lockout, they just borrowed from American English. A lockout is when bosses don't let their workers come into the factories, okay, or come into the place of work. So they really developed the Ladino language and renewed the language. This is how they saw it. It was part of their ideology. And it's very, very important to acknowledge that. They also brought in classes, teaching people not only Judeo-Spanish as a formal language, you could learn to read and write and express yourself in Ladino, but also they brought in classes on politics, on labor, on Marxism. They brought in classes on French, on Greek. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'd like to emphasize the role of women in the Socialist Federation and in the movement more generally. It was actually a Jewish woman, Buena Nehama, who was one of the workers in Salonika, who introduced from Spanish, actually modern Spanish, compañeros y compañeras, to refer to comrades, having already an awareness of the way in which socialist parties are working in Latin America. And that key kind of connection, and already a consciousness of connections between different kinds of Spanish-speaking socialist activists across continents, will be very important for understanding how dynamics play out in the American context. Women and young women, especially teenage women, were disproportionately represented in the factory labor in Salonika. Okay, and it's a very, very fascinating phenomenon. We don't have the chance to get into all of the particulars about it right now, but I would like to emphasize the way this played out in the case of the tobacco industry, in which Jewish women were largely responsible for sorting and drying the tobacco. But because of the way in which the patriarchal system of the society was preserved, the Jewish women were largely responsible for dealing with the lower grade tobacco. Okay, in some, they were admitted into the Socialist Labor Party, and some of them took leadership roles. Some of them contributed to the press, but many of them worked, and many of them worked very long days, including even pregnant women. We have records of pregnant Jewish women working in the tobacco factories for 10 to 12 hours. Okay, I want to just mention a major strike that takes place in 1914, just after Salonika becomes part of Greece. And so it's a major transition that's taking place. And we see some conflict emerge as the Jewish laborers would like to renegotiate the terms of their contract. And this will actually result in the first major collective bargaining action in the history of modern Greece, would be initiated in Salonika, largely as a result of Jewish activism through the Federation. And what winds up happening is that the men are involved in negotiating. The bosses of some of these factories, while the strike is taking place, call in scabs. And who do they bring in? They bring in Muslim women refugees who had come to the city from other parts of the Balkans. And what we see emerge on the streets of Salonika for the first time is Jewish-Muslim conflict, in which Jewish and Muslim women are fighting each other, and Jewish women are confronting the Greek police. So it becomes not only a class issue, but also an ethnic issue. And the Jewish women who are literally on the front lines defending the workers' rights, even though they're in a lesser position, we have wonderful, fascinating reports of Jewish women clawing at the Greek police officers with their nails and beating the police officers. And the Greek police sort of come in and subdue the Jewish women, who are no longer considered protesting for their rights, but, as you will not be surprised to hear, are deemed rioters. They are deemed anti-Greek. They are deemed individuals representing the Jewish community who is against the Greek people, against the Greek nation, and wants to usurp the natural order. And how is this most represented? Because the Jewish men, the Greek press argues, could not even be real men because they sent the women to do the job of the men, and they are destroying the order, the natural order of gender relations as it relates to labor and public placement. These series of strikes result, in combination with many of the other transformations that are taking place in the region, over a decade of war, the end of the Ottoman Empire, compulsory military service, rising nationalism, anti-Semitism, the allure of labor opportunities, the labor unrest that I just described, as well as America being specifically an interesting place for some of the people involved in the Salonican Socialist Workers' Federation, who were largely against the war. They went to the United States because the United States was not participating in the war at that time. They did not join World War I until 1917, not only because of what you probably heard about American isolationism, but there was also in the domestic space in the United States a war against the war, as one scholar referred to it as recently, in which there was a major anti-war movement in the United States that brought together a wide variety of religious movements, racial groups, and also labor movements that was arguing against American entrance into the war, and they were able to succeed for a few years. And it is during that period, 1915 and 1916 especially, that we see the vast majority of the Jews who leave Salonika and come to the United States. They come exactly during that time. And they are joined by other Jews from the region, from Rhodes, from Izmir, from Kavala, from Kastoria, from Sofia, from Istanbul, Tekirdağ, Edirne. And they come especially to the city of New York. And as I've discussed in the previous lectures, they did not receive a warm welcome, neither by immigration officials who could not identify who they were and often subjected them to deportation proceedings, but also, and perhaps even especially, by the already established Ashkenazi Jewish community. And here we can see a depiction of these strangers on the Lower East Side. Who are these strangers who can be seen on the ghetto of the Lower East Side, sitting outside of coffee houses, smoking strange-looking water pipes, sipping a dark liquid from tiny cups and playing a game of checkers and dice, right? This is coffee that they're drinking, and it's backgammon, sheshbesh that they're playing. See the signs on these institutions? They read Cafe Constantinople, Cafe Oriental, Cafe Smyrna, and there are other signs in Hebrew characters that you perhaps cannot read. Are they Jews? No, it cannot be. They do not look like Jews. They do not speak Yiddish. Listen, what is that strange tongue they are using? It sounds like Spanish or Mexican. Are they Spaniards or Mexicans? If so, where did they get the coffee houses, an importation from Greece and Turkey? You know, these coffee houses would not only be a visible sign of the Sephardic Jews' difference, their exoticism, their Oriental nature, their non-European identity, but it would also be a place that would come under great scrutiny by the press and also by police in the city of New York. There were a lot of concerns about, you know, the cafes were oftentimes empty during the daytime and they were full at night. And the press would say, this is because, see, the Levantine Jews, because of their Oriental background, the slow pace of life under the sun of the deserts of the Middle East, I mean, this is the language that these depictions use, they're loafing around. They're lazy. They're not even working. But what they didn't realize is that because of who they were, and because even those who came with higher education, many of them could only get jobs in factories. Battery factories, light bulb factories, kimono factories, other kinds of textile factories, and many of them were working the night shift. And so in the days, the cafes were full, and in the nighttime they were often empty because they were working in the night. Some of the people who were in these cafes, they saw them not only as social spaces, not only as a place to have a glass of raki or maybe a few glasses of raki after a hard day of work, but these became places of cultural discussion and of political organizing. And here you can see the Salonika restaurant being advertised in the socialist newspaper back in Salonika. It says, you know, when you go to New York, be sure to visit Restaurant Salonique on Christie Street on the Lower East Side. And here it's a place where you could go to read the newspapers, the Ladino newspapers. It's a place where you would go to get your mail. And here we have a postcard that was addressed to David Menashe on 184 Christie Street. That's the address that became the Salonika restaurant we just saw in the previous picture. And people would put down the address of the Salonika Cafe when you were coming in Ellis Island. They said, who are you going to see? You'd say some friend at 184 Christie Street. Not because that friend lived there, but because that's where you knew you would be able to find him and meet him. And it's there at 184 Christie Street where La Juventud Saloniquiota se organiza. The Salonican Jewish youth begins to organize. And it is there that the former secretary of the Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonika, a guy by the name of Maurice Nassim, began to organize the Salonican youth and established what would become known as the Salonisian Brotherhood of America. We talked about this last time, but I think it's very, very important to note here a couple of things about the Salonisian Brotherhood of America, which was founded in 1915. Just to give you some of the other names, Jacques Hassid was the first president, and the other officers included a gentleman by the name of Henri Perachia, who was the first secretary, Izzy Pardo, Victor Cohen, Joseph Saltiel, who is the owner of the Salonika restaurant, Sadi Pesach, Joseph Angel, Moïse Atas, and Maurice Nassim himself. They quickly accumulated 100 members, and within a few years, there were 2,000 families associated with the organization, and it quickly became the largest of all of the mutual aid societies among the Levantine Ladino-speaking Jews in New York and across the country. And what made the Brotherhood distinct? Not only was it founded by the former secretary of the Socialist Federation of Salonika, and not only were many of its early members of that same Salonika Federation, but it was interested not only in mutual aid in terms of health and death benefits, just like the taifas, the porters guilds back in Salonika. They took inspiration from that, but they also took inspiration from their socialist background and brought together efforts and agendas to promote the industrial, social, educational, and religious welfare of its members, to assist them in becoming American citizens, and furthermore, to cultivate the study of literature, art, and the sciences. And the Ladino press, including the Zionist Ladino press, was in awe of the organization because it did so much more than the other organizations in terms of studying this element of studying literature, art, and the sciences. No other organization had this as a principal prong of their agenda. And the other thing that the Hermandad did early on was it opened its doors to all Sephardim in the city for participation in meetings. So it wasn't just Saloniklis going to the meetings, although initially, principally Salonikans were members, but people from Rhodes and people from Izmir and people from other places would also participate in these meetings and discussions. And you can see, again, it was not a ideologically pure or exclusive organization either. And you can see in a 1917 pamphlet here by Yuda Sadi, who was also one of the early members of the organization, was involved in the socialist movement. But he says, look, Zionistas socialistas, venid en junto en la hermandad, decimos nuestros ideales por un cierto tiempo. Olvidad por henchir el programa en el seno de esta organización que demuestra fuerzas, espera su salvación. Okay, and so it's looking at the way in which the organization can bring together Sephardim and Sephardim who are Zionists and socialists, a wide variety of political identities coming together under this one roof for shared goals. Now, Maurice Nassim, the guy who called that initial meeting that resulted in the creation of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, his newspaper, La Voz del Pueblo, was a socialist newspaper. Many of the members of the Brotherhood were involved in socialist activities and discussions at that time. And he and some others attempted to make some overtures to the Yiddish socialists. And they had like a few months where they were working kind of together, but the differences that we've described all throughout that separated the Sephardim and the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim were too big to overcome, especially because language was so central to both of these movements that short period of cooperation in 1918 did not last very long. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Maurice Nassim became much more deeply involved in communism and became much more associated with and associated himself with communist revolution and an association with the Soviet Union. So he becomes the target of surveillance, both by the police and by the FBI. And he becomes at the same time the secretary of the communist office on the Lower East Side, that is inter-ethnic and interdenominational. And he winds up publishing and printing his own communist leaflets. And he gets arrested by the police. And essentially during the infamous Palmer raids, during the Red Scare at the end of World War I. And he is on the verge of being deported. And instead of being deported, he flees. And he goes to France, where he spends several years in France. And he comes back to the United States several years later under an assumed name, claiming to be a French citizen born in Cairo. Very interesting. Okay. And he comes under an assumed name, and he lives the rest of his life largely involved in supporting French cultural enterprises. But I think what's very fascinating here is this kind of transformation that he represents, delving more deeply into left politics beyond the framework of the Sephardic community. His brother, however, Shimon Nissim, remains very deeply involved in Sephardic community life. He is also an editor of his own short-lived Ladino newspaper called La Luz, which means the light. And he is also not only perhaps the first Sephardic graduate of an American law school, being New York School of Law, becomes a lawyer to defend the interests and rights of his fellow Sephardim, because he recognizes the power of the legal system in this country, and that in order to make change in this society, laws need to be adjudicated, and sometimes they need to be changed. He served as the president of the Sephardic Brotherhood and many other Sephardic organizations on numerous occasions, but I want to bring your attention to him because he is also the author of the first Ladino novella published in the United States. And it is called America, America, un romanzo sobre la vida sefaradita en América que aparecía en partes en estos colonas cada semana. So it's called America, America, like a novel, a novella about Sephardic life in America. And I want to tell you about this. It's never been translated. It's a wonderful story. I mean, it's a very gripping. I mean, I was gripped by it. It begins with the story of Alberto, a Turquino, a Sephardic Jew from the Ottoman Empire, who is returning home from a shift at the factory, and it's raining outside. And he's going through the streets of the Lower East Side, and he bumps into some what appeared to him to be Italian guys who mock him for his clothes, steal his hat, and before he knows it, he's getting beat up. This is how the story begins. Él se imaginaba que en un país libero como la América, cada uno podía vestirse a su gusto y a mesura de su poder. Mas bien presto él descubrió que se topaba en el hierro. Alberto was imagining that in a free place, like a free country like America, each and every person could dress as he or she pleases according to his ability. But very soon he realized that he was wrong. And this would be one of the first of many discoveries that the protagonist, Alberto, makes through his life, recognizing that he also soon realizes that America is not free and people do not care in the way that he wants them to care, because the worst thing about when he was getting beat up was that all of the merchants and the pushcart peddlers and everybody that was just standing there on the Lower East Side, they all observed him getting beat up and nobody intervened. Nobody did anything to help him out. And he says that power, force, is la reina del mundo, rules the world. Del nuevo como del viejo, the new world and the old world. Y que en el corazón ande el amor de la moneda se hizo la morada, no hay lugar para ningún otro amor ni para ningún otro sentimiento. And in the heart where love of money dwells, there is no place for any other kind of love, nor for any other kind of sentiment. What does he do? He essentially gets pissed and he tries to rally his fellow Turquinos, who are largely initially apathetic. But then he decides to read. And he reads and reads and reads. And what does he discover? He discovers socialismo, sindicalismo y unionismo. Él venía en contacto con viejos conocidos. And in reading about socialism, he comes in contact with old friends. Él encontraba en sus lecturas los principios de Moshe, metidas en una forma moderna. Él veía en el socialismo la realización de los sueños de los profetas judíos que él había empezado a amar y a venerar mientras su chiquez. And he, it's fascinating. He discovers in his reading the principles of Moses, put in a modern form. He sees in socialism the realization of the dreams of the Jewish prophets that he had absorbed and loved and venerated since his childhood. And he becomes a socialist and organizes his fellow Turquinos. And then there's a love interest, and you'll have to read the rest on your own. Just briefly, a few other quick examples of socialist activism in the Sephardic sphere. They wind up creating their own Sephardic branch of the Socialist Party that is active for nearly 20 years. They create a socialist Ladino songbook at the end of World War I. It's fascinating. I couldn't find any recordings of anybody singing them, but they are creating cultural products in Ladino, trying to make class transformation, which we'll also see some of them tie also to race hierarchy transformation. And I want to give you two examples and then wrap up. The first example is a gentleman by the name of Abraham Moïse, who took the pseudonym Alberto Moro, which means Albert the Brown Man, which is also kind of interesting. He was from Salonika himself. His father was Salonican. His mother was a Romanio Jew from Yanina. He was a member of the Socialist Workers Federation. He was arrested in Salonika for his anti-war initiatives, and he came to the United States fleeing, and he had first got a job at a flashlight factory on Long Island. He continued his political activism, and he wrote for Ladino newspapers, for Spanish language newspapers, for African-American newspapers in New York, and he was based in Harlem. And you know, why is Spanish Harlem called Harlem? And you can read this in the memoirs of some of the first Puerto Ricans who come to Harlem at the time. He says that when we come to Harlem, there were already Spanish speakers there. And they're referring to the Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire. And many Puerto Ricans come, and there are some really fascinating intercommunal dynamics that emerge in Harlem through these connections. And my colleague Aviva Ben-Or has written a little bit about this, but not in terms of the political activism. So the Socialist Party and the Communist Party set up Spanish bureaus in Harlem in the late 1920s. And both of those bureaus are run by Sephardic Jews who are helping to organize and politicize Latinx workers, especially Puerto Rican women working in factories. So they're kind of, in some ways, replicating the process that they had already experienced in Salonika itself. So they came with political know-how, they came with political acumen, and they're bringing it to bear in the American context. Figure like Alberto Moreau becomes very involved in the Communist Party, so much so that he even runs for office unsuccessfully. But he also becomes one of the founders of essentially an academic field of Chicano studies. He is the co-author of the first study about Latin Americans in the United States and their struggles as workers in this country, and has a large portion of his study dedicated to the racial discrimination that they face and to creating ways and means to address that racial discrimination. What's fascinating about him, however, is that he does not retain a connection with the Sephardic community. He enters into the communist realm, and he essentially enters into the Spanish-speaking domain, so much so that when he is buried and eulogies are given about him, and there's a bunch of hagiography about him, praising him, panegyrics about him and his work, he is remembered as an Argentine. He's so much assimilated into that milieu. The final example I want to give you is of another gentleman. I want to return you to the story of my extended Ayash clan and tell you the story of Shabbatai Ayash, who in America took on the name Edward, or in Spanish, he was known as Eduardo. He was also a member of the Salonika Socialist Federation. He was a pharmacist, and he spent a little bit of time in Palestine before coming to the United States and settling in Harlem, where he became involved with the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And he was involved in political discussions and organizing efforts with other members of the Brotherhood in their broader Sephardic circle. Here you can see, by the way, Ayash with his Ottoman passport, figures like Leon Sadi, Sabi Nahama, Samuel Dasa, Moise Sulam, even Alberto Matarazzo, who was a rabbi. He was a graduate of the Rabbinical Academy in Salonika. He was deeply involved in the socialist movement during World War I. Even Ayash's wife, Gilda, was also involved in these political discussions, and the children would participate in these discussions at different people's houses. As a pharmacist, he got together with one of his customers, Leon Davis, and they formed a union of pharmacists and druggists, the SEIU 1199, which soon became affiliated with the American Federation of Labor. It organized not only drugstore, principally white Jewish leadership, but also joined forces with porters, clerks, and other drugstore workers. And by World War II, there were 6,000 members. And it expanded further and made common cause with primarily women of color. 85% of the nurses, aides, dietary aides, orderlies, dishwashers, porters, laundry laborers were Black and Latinx women. And they were brought into this union eventually. After much debate and much efforts on the part of the American government, the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, to strike down efforts at striking and at organizing across class and race lines. He was persecuted for a time, so much so that he had to go into hiding, spent hours in boiler rooms and hidden behind false walls, and was brought before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. But eventually, they were able to succeed in becoming the first major union to desegregate and the first union in the healthcare field to desegregate. And it is now the largest of the healthcare unions in the United States, with over 400,000 members. He was the founding secretary and treasurer. It was the first to integrate Blacks, whites, and especially Puerto Ricans, and to spur civil rights activities, and it became known as Martin Luther King's favorite union. And here we have Ayash with MLK in one of their numerous meetings together, which they became personal friends in their efforts to work on civil rights. All the while, Ayash remained deeply involved and committed to the Sephardic Brotherhood. His son Irving, who was very kind and provided me with much of the information that I'm sharing with you, including images, is still involved with the Brotherhood and spoke to me about how his father continued to see the Brotherhood as a core space and the Sephardic community as a core space for his activity and his expression of his identity and community that was not to the exclusion of his effort to work across racial lines for civil rights for all and racial solidarity. Now, I want to conclude. We cannot get into everything that happened after World War II, but World War II really is a major period of transformation. Essentially, Sephardic Jews will wind up after World War II, especially those who look white, on the white side of things. Much of the discrimination will fall to the wayside in terms of its institutionalized character. They will not be excluded from neighborhoods. Largely, they will not be able to not get loans. They will not be able to be excluded from citizenship. They will participate in white flight. Radical politics will come to an end, both because many of these families achieve middle-class status. They invest in their whiteness and in their Americanness, and also because they are put down for their organizing. They are really, the political activism among the Sephardic Jews, among many others, is snuffed out by the state apparatus. At the same time, the culture of the Sephardic Jews is deeply imperiled. The home communities are largely destroyed during the Holocaust: Salonika, Rhodes, Sarajevo. And Ladino disappears as a language of everyday use. Where does that leave us now, 1, 2, 3 generations later? I've tried to describe a process of confrontation that the Sephardic Jews experienced coming into the American experiment, the efforts to navigate that experience, and efforts to transform it. But the transformation of this dynamic met with mixed results, and it did not fully materialize all of the results that were promised. I wanted to bring to you a sense of the injustice of the system, the way in which we ought to, as Sephardic people and people interested in the Sephardic and Jewish experience, recognize that that this experience, this unjust system, has deeply impacted us in largely insidious ways that we may not even be aware of, that have contributed to the erosion of our culture, of our language, of our sense of identity, of our sense of community. And I want to bring this to your attention. I want to bring this to your attention, the problems that remain in American society. This hierarchy that we see here, it has not been fully destroyed. You know, what people like Ash were looking for was not a hierarchy. They were looking for solidarity across racial, ethnic, and religious lines, a sense of equality. Equality despite difference or because of difference. And I want you to recognize that system and the ways that we as Sephardic people have been implicated in that system. Both the targets of the system, but also the beneficiaries of that system, to wake up from that malaise and to take action both to reclaim our own identity and to work for broader racial justice initiatives. And that's what I would like to ask for as a concluding thought. You know, I bring this to you, again, referring to Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing that can be changed until it is faced. I hope that these lectures have offered an opportunity for us to face the way in which the unjust systems of the United States have continued to shape our own experience as Sephardic Jews and continued to have very detrimental impacts on other people who live in our country, especially people of color, especially Black Americans. I think the next step is reclamation. We have to take back our identity. We have to take back our language. We have to take back our identity in all of its manifestation. Borekas are great, we want those. Canticas are great, we want those. Liturgy is great, we want those. But there should be no domain in which the Sephardic experience should not penetrate our consciousness. Why not? Why should we not have a political conscience as Sephardim? This is an era in which identity and politics are very strongly linked. I hope some of you will be interested in thinking about our past, thinking about how we can create a series of Sephardic voices, because just like back for the Sephardic Brotherhood, there will be not one voice, there will be many voices, but that draw on the Sephardic experience, and may that past and the voices that we articulate bring us to action. I conclude with an invitation for those of you who may be interested, or those of you who you may know who may not be on part of these conversations, to join us through the Sephardic Brotherhood. And I think it's fitting that the Brotherhood should take a role in developing some community conversations, some public forums in the upcoming months to discuss what is the future of Sephardic life. How does the Sephardic voice, can it be re-articulated and reclaimed? And what does it have to do with the broader discussion about race and inequity in the United States? I hope you will join us for those conversations. Merci mucho.
Dr. Naar, thank you so much. Hazaku Baruch, as we say, Hazaku Baruch, as we say in the Sephardic community. Mashallah, a beautiful talk as always. Before we take some questions, we'll take some questions. If you're interested in writing questions, please enter them into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. As you know, it is late, and we want to be mindful of everyone's time. And if we don't get to your question, we will definitely refer to Dr. Naar for his attention as well. Just a reminder, thank you all so much again for joining us tonight. These events are only possible with your support. And I just want to remind everyone that it's only through your support, only through your sponsorship and your participation that these are possible. And we want to acknowledge again the underwriter for this event tonight, the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation. Thank you all so much for supporting us. And if you're interested in seeing more good content and seeing more voices from the Sephardic world, as Dr. Naar mentioned, please consider supporting us. Please consider getting involved. Please consider sponsoring a class or a series, or becoming even a member of the Sephardic Brotherhood and becoming active as we start to have these wider conversations. As Dr. Naar mentioned, in the next month or so, we'll be sending out more information about these open forums we plan to have to discuss the future of Sephardic Jewry in the United States and how we can play a role. One other thing I'll mention right now, I'll be putting a short, brief survey. It's a 2-minute survey about this class series. We'd love it if you take it right there at that link. If you please take the survey, it's only 2 or 3 minutes. It'd really help us to hear about your thoughts about the class series and what you liked, what you want to see in the future. If there's other content you'd like to see, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you all so much. Now, let's jump into questions, Dr. Naar. Let's see. Sorry, just scrolling through. Okay. Question from the previous week. Dr. Naar, you mentioned that the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic community in last week's lecture had a kind of worldview that looked down at other Jews. And we see the same thing that happened in Amsterdam, where the SCP Sephardic community looked down on the Ashkenazim in Amsterdam as well. And it seems that same attitude was present in the New World. Can you comment a little bit on this kind of like inter-Sephardic communal tension?
I think that these inter-communal tensions are internalizations of the broader hierarchies of Western civilization, if we could say, that privileges Europeanness, whiteness, and and Christianity in some ways. And in some ways, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, because of their success and the ways in which they were able to make some linkages with the power structures, both in the Netherlands and in the colonies in the America, including in the United States, they were better positioned to take on that mantle and to claim the status as grandees in the United States and elsewhere. And that same kind of racial hierarchy that we were looking at earlier, that is exactly reflected within the Jewish realm, right? So you think about Britain and the Netherlands are at the top, right, of that hierarchy, very close to the top. And then it goes kind of down, Germany, then Russia, and Poland, and then Turkey, right? So it's a internalization of this broader kind of structure of a kind of racial and civilizational hierarchy, of which the Spanish and Portuguese Jews did not create, but they were also implicated and imbricated in that very system.
Dr. Naar, I wonder if you can actually comment a little bit on the Sephardic role. You mentioned it a little bit with Mr. Ayash and others, but can you maybe comment on the Sephardic role in the 60s and 70s during the civil rights era, just a little bit?
Yes. I would say the best example that I have, and unfortunately, like I I couldn't do everything.
We need another set of talks
you
just for this
need
issue.
another series. You read my book. If I ever write it, I need to write it, but I'm working on it. But I would say, I think one of the best examples to think about in terms of Sephardic participation in civil rights and the way in which it revealed the vulnerability of Sephardic Jews themselves is in the case of Montgomery, Alabama. During the Montgomery boycotts, the rabbi of the Sephardic congregation in Montgomery, Alabama, Akrish, he was Moroccan. His congregants were mostly of Ottoman background from Rhodes and Turkey. He spoke in favor of desegregation, and he preached it. He preached it from his pulpit. How was this met? Bomb threats by the neighboring white community. Bomb threats. The threat of violence compelled him to go quiet. So he ceased advocating for desegregation as a result of these threats to his congregation, to him personally, to his family. And so this reveals the fragility of this dynamic, right? So it's like, and the difficult positions that Sephardic Jews who still preserve some of this borderline status, right? They want to ally themselves with others who are disenfranchised, but then to do so might require them to sacrifice their own rights and privileges, even their physical safety. And I think it's very difficult to pass judgment, but it is important to explain how those decisions were made.
Professor Ben Mayor asks, as the Freemasons were involved in the Young Turk Revolution, is there evidence of political connections between Masonic lodges in Salonika and those in New York? The lodge in East Harlem was founded by Cubans and Colombians in the 19th century, and it had a heavy Sephardic membership in the 20th century.
That is absolutely true. And Aviva Ben-Hur has talked a little bit about this in her book. But I do not know the extent to which the Salonican lodges and the Harlem lodges were in conversation. It would make sense that they would have been. I mean, the Socialist Federation had representatives and fundraising efforts in New York, in Salonika. I don't know why necessarily the Freemason efforts would not have some kind of parallel practice. I know that many members of my family, the men, were members of different Masonic lodges or attempted to be members of Masonic lodges in the case of my grandfather, who was not admitted. But Masonry is very important, and people who were Masons were also involved in the socialist, some of the socialist activities in Salonika. It's a great question that requires further investigation. So if you have an answer, Professor Ben Mayor, I'm looking forward to it.
We have another question here. I did not hear you use the term multiculturalism, but it seems that the position held by mutual aid societies regarding the recognition of a range of cultures and languages coexisting within a larger society is described by this term. Would you agree, or do you see a difference?
Yes, I think that multiculturalism is a very good way to describe the dynamics that are at play, both in terms of what was going on even in the Ottoman Empire, and even the way in which cross-communal dynamics played out in the United States, organizing with Blacks, organizing with Latinx people. I did not use that term because of it is a term that has a very specific political meaning that comes out of the 1990s, essentially. And so I think if we talk about multiculturalism, then we are not prioritizing the category of race. And I think that understanding race right now is very, very important for our contemporary political conversation. So as much as cultures are important in the broad scheme of things, the way that American definitions of identity work is race is prioritized, I would say. But I think it's a great question and requires further conversation as well.
Another question actually from a friend of ours from Turkey who's now in Canada. Is there a way to advance a Sephardic vision that can still show an interest in the quote unquote old country of Turkey and Greece and the existing communities there, especially with regards to the political imagination you described?
I think that if you do not have the old country in mind when you're building a vision for 21st century Sephardic identity, you will not succeed. And I would say that if you want to participate, as I'm advocating for, in a reclamation of all of the domains of activity and thought and expression in the Sephardic cultural and political sphere, the old country, Turkey, Greece, and other geographies need to be part of that story. It was, I mean, I couldn't get into it, but actually the reason that those Salonican young men congregated at the Salonika Cafe on Christie Street in 1915 was not initially because they were like, we need to create our own mutual aid organization. It was actually because they received a request from a philanthropy back in Salonika that was in need. And they said, we need, and it was actually a Jewish insane asylum, if you can believe that. It's a fascinating story. Asilo de Locos de Salonico, that was, they were having in a very tough bind, and the honor of the Jewish community in Salonika was on the line, and they needed funds to help expand and support the Jewish insane asylum. So that's why they initially congregated together to try to organize a fundraising campaign. And when they began that fundraising campaign, they realized, wait, we should really be looking after also our own interests and advocating for ourselves here in the United States. So actually out of those meetings at Cafe Salonika on the Lower East Side came the publicity committee for the Salonika Asilo de Locos and the foundational committee that developed the statutes for the Salonika Brotherhood of America that later became the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. So I would say to the query, it is essential to have a kind of international perspective in thinking about the future of Sephardic Jewish community and identity in the United States.
Professor Naar, this lecture taught me so much history that meant so much to learn. Thank you so much. You focused, as you discussed, the political leanings and activity on Salonican Jews specifically. Do you know more about the leftist, or right, I should say as well, activity from the Ottoman Jews from other locales, Istanbul, Monastir, etc.?
It's a really great question. And I think there are two ways to answer that. Number one is that the Salonican Jews brought in Jews from other places of origin, Istanbul, Izmir, Monastir. Because this is really an unresearched domain, we do not have like a list. So like in 1918, I know that there were 150 members of the Sephardic branch of the Socialist Party. I know like 5 of their names. So I'm in search. If you have any information about any clues about who were the socialists, and then these are the card-carrying members of the party, then they had these extended clan and family circles that were part of these conversations, I'd love to know. I'd love to know. I would say the other thing to think about is that it's very important to note that the Socialist Party was the first Sephardic political organization established in the United States. It comes 10 years before a Democratic Club is established. And that's established in 1924 by a gentleman by the name of Alberto Amato, who was from Milas near Izmir. And he would become the first non-Salonican president of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And he would become a very important figure actually in the democratic machine in the United States. So if you want, we can have a whole, you want to bring me back? I did like the more progressive left. We can do about a talk about Sephardic Jews and the Democratic Party. The one about Sephardic Jews in the Republican Party would be a little bit shorter, I think, only because I'm not aware of many Sephardic Jews getting involved in the Democratic Party until the 70s, and including one very important member of the Sephardic Brotherhood, Najari, Maurice Najari, who was a state prosecutor. So I think the full range of political expression was part of the Sephardic experience. And at least judging by my Facebook feed today, there are Sephardic people on all sides of the political spectrum who are of Sephardic background.
I think we'll take maybe 1 or 2 more questions just to be mindful of time. Our dear friend Rochelle Amado Bordnik asks, the term Jews of color is being used a lot lately. What do you think of this term?
Well, it's a really great question. Jews of color is a term that comes out of this multicultural movement, I believe in the 90s, and it was articulated by Black Jews and other Jews of color as a way to create a sense of coalition. And I think that that's really what the term tries to do. And I've been in conversation with some of my colleagues and friends who are who are advocating for the use of this term and want to see it as a coalition building term. So sometimes they say JOCSM, so Jews of color and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, bringing it together as an umbrella or coalition term that refers to minoritized Jews, Jews who have not been represented in the mainstream, Jews who have had their Jewishness denigrated or denied, Jews who do not fit the paradigms that are operative in the United States. Like, where's the movie about a Sephardic Jew? Like, there's this one not so good Tom Hanks movie that has a Sephardic character in it. Maybe some of you have seen, but doesn't exist. There's a kind of invisibility. There's a kind of invisibility there. And so the effort of the JOCSM coalition movements and various organizations, especially progressive Jewish organizations, will have JOC or JOCSM caucuses where they discuss and try to advocate for better representation, for more rights, and for building kind of coalitions. It has a political function. But I think it's very important to distinguish between, like, when we're thinking about relationships with the state, if you're like, a Black Jew is going to have a very different experience walking the streets of the United States than a Jew from Turkey or from Salonika or from Rhodes, probably based on how they look. And I think that's a very, very important distinction to make, to recognize that it may be important for strategic and conceptual and political purposes to bring together these different kinds of groups in a coalition, but also to acknowledge the very real differences in their lived experiences in this country.
Another quick question. Can you speak, well, not so quick, I should say, can you speak a bit of the Sephardic Mizrahi distinction and kind of the disingenuousness of making Jews from the Middle East and North Africa and Southern Europe and the former Ottoman Empire into this one pan-Sephardic category?
This is, again, a internalization into the Jewish space of the dominant European framework, where there's Europe and everybody else. There is Europe, Europe matters, Europe is important, Europe is leading the show. And if you're outside of Europe, you are outside. You are third world, you are second or third world. Your voice is less important. It doesn't matter. It doesn't, okay? The term Sephardi or the term Mizrahi, these are sometimes used interchangeably. They're sometimes used in different kinds of ways, but in essence, they capture this non-European or non-Ashkenazi-ness of these Jewish communities from the Muslim world. Like, there are different kinds of cognate terms that are all used to remind you of the non-Europeanness of those Jewish communities. And it's like fascinating to see how there's this other category of MENA Jews, Middle Eastern and North African Jews. And the way in which the boundaries between Europe and the Middle East have shifted has also had an impact on how Sephardic Jews are seen and see themselves. So, like, are Jews from Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, are they part of the Middle East and North Africa? Because if it's European Jews and MENA Jews, where is Bulgarian Jews? But that's not really European in the way that we mean European. And certainly Greece is not part of that. So then there's like this yet another layer of invisibility that emerges in this conversation. It also has dramatic ramifications for thinking about Israel and Palestine as well. And you'll have to have me back for another talk on that.
Then we'll take one last question. I'm not going to use the term. I think you know the term I'm going to reference, Dr. Naar. Are you aware of the term, the S word used in Yiddish against Sephardic Jews as a derogatory insult based on race?
Yes. Yes. This is a term that I have come across being referred to Sephardic Jews, or also cognate Turkish Yidden was a term that I used, which was meant in a derogatory kind of way in Yiddish. The way that it comes up more It gets into a whole discourse about language's pejorative terms that are used within the Jewish world. There are some really terrible terms that have been deployed, internalized racism that is really despicable and damaging. That is a ramification of these same processes that I'm describing, of trying to cleave to European white domination and trying to seek protection and privileges and rights from that framework, denigrating yet others. I would just say one other thing about that term. That is also the inspiration, one of the inspirations or one of the reasons why the Israeli Black Panther Party is called the Black Panther Party. Not only did they take inspiration, this is principally Mizrahi Jews, Moroccan and other Jews from North Africa especially, and some from further east, in the Middle East. The term Black Panthers is an effort to reclaim a term, that S word used in Yiddish, and another Hebrew origin Yiddish word, Haya, which means, it's the derogatory for black beasts is what the term was. So they reclaim that term and they say, we are black beasts. Fine, we are the Black Panthers, and this is how we will draw inspiration and power and speak our voice and stand up to the white Ashkenazi European hegemony in Israel, going even so far in the 1970s to claim that the Ashkenazi Israeli establishment, by denigrating Arab Jewish culture, or claiming that it is impossible to be Arab and Jewish at the same time, that you cannot speak Arabic if you're a real Jew because you're a representative of the enemy. They went so far as to claim that the Israeli establishment was perpetrating cultural genocide against the Mizrahi Jews. Some really intense intra-Jewish dynamics and hatred that are all absorptions, internalizations of these broader dynamics and power struggles that are at play.
Okay, with that, I know we still haven't gotten to many questions, but I want to say I appreciate all the questions that we've been asked, and we're going to refer them to Dr. Naar. I'm sure he'll try to get back to you as much as he can. I want to thank Dr. Naar again for leading this incredible three-part series, this fascinating series with a lot of information about the community that I personally didn't know, and certainly I'm sure many of us didn't know. I want to thank again the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for their support, as well as our partnership with Congregation Orva Shalom and the Seattle Sephardic Network. I want to thank all of you again for participating in this class, and I hope we can see you, Sekel Dio, inshallah, God willing, at many more classes through our Sephardic Digital Academy and at new programs, Sekel Dio, in our new Sephardic Forum we're going to be starting next month and soon after. Dr. Naar, thank you so much, and Al Vermos, everyone.